solution that was the Halo array, the idea of shield worlds was presented by the same Didact we fought in Halo 4 prior to corruption by a certain cosmic entity. Though used in wars long before the emergence of the Flood, the Didact proposed the construction of thousands more of these artificial planets, which would serve numerous purposes. As military outposts, they would be mobile, able to jump directly into flood-infested space and clear out entire systems at a time. Others would serve as research stations for finding more effective methods of fighting the Flood. Combined with the Didact's star-hopping strategy, which focused on locations of strategic importance while ignoring others, at least for a time, the Didact and his warrior servants would, ideally, be able to hold and take back key systems before focus on eliminating the larger Flood threat. Fun fact, the star-hopping strategy mentioned is based on the real-world island-hopping strategy used by the United States to more effectively combat Japan during World War II. Other types of shield worlds would also be used to protect life forms, Forerunner or otherwise, during the fighting. However, the Didact strategy was compromised by politics within the Forerunner ecumene. Several hundred would be built, but never in the numbers that the Didact had proposed. The Shield World project would ultimately be abandoned until the final years of the Forerunner Flood War, as the Didact was forced into exile. The Forerunners were initially alerted to the existence of the Flood during their conflict with the ancient human Sanshayum Empire around 110,000 years ago. To combat the Flood, ancient humanity had conversed with a being known as the Primordial or the Timeless One. Through it, humanity found what they called a cure, though it was anything but. This cure was given to a full third of the human population at the time, and these countless billions were put directly in the path of the Flood. The cure, once exposed to the Flood supercell, caused a cascade of cell destruction, killing the Flood and forcing them to retreat. For thousands of years, Forerunner scientists would study this, even using human essences harvested with the Composer to try and rediscover this supposed cure. Towards the end of the Forerunner Flood War, the Primordial revealed to the ISO Didact, a clone of sorts of the original Didact, that the cure was a fabrication. The Primordial, actually being a gravemind, had fed what it claimed was false information to ancient humanity, and the Flood had willingly retreated as part of a larger strategy to destroy the Forerunners. Whether the cure is real or not remains a point of debate to this day, but for the Forerunners, it remained a desperate solution forever out of their reach. Another method of fighting the Flood was the aforementioned Composer. This device used neurophysics, a form of science favored by the ancient precursors and only barely understood by the Forerunners, to scan the patterns of a living being and convert it into a digital essence. Interestingly, this mirrors quite closely how smart AI like Cortana are created. As a tool against the Flood, the Composer was intended to scan an infected individual and convert them into a digital essence. The Flood corruption could be removed from the essence and then imprinted on an artificially constructed, healthy body. Unfortunately, all attempts to restore these essences failed, the artificial bodies decaying and dying. The Composer would, however, find use again late in the war by the Didact, aka the original Didact, during his personal efforts to find a counter to the Halo array. After several failed attempts to make himself immune to the Flood via genetic manipulation, another plan the Forerunners at large had tried, the Didact would use the Composer to create the Promethean Knights. The first batch of Knights, created from actual Forerunner Prometheans who had volunteered to undergo the process, seemed to be effective, but not on the scale necessary. The Didact was convinced that he simply needed more Knights, and got them by composing untold numbers of ancient humans. The Didact would ultimately be stopped by his wife, the Librarian, before these new essences were deployed against the Flood. During their search for a more effective means of combating the Flood, the Forerunners often came across life forms that presented possible countermeasures. One of these were the truly alien Lekgolo worms. Each worm is rather simple on its own, incapable of complex thought. However, when working together in colonies, the worms become part of a larger collective, single mind capable of consciousness and sapience. These Gestalt forms, specifically a colony form known as Lekgolo, presented a possible method of combating the Flood, though the details remain unknown. One remnant of these experiments would be encountered by then ONI agent Jameson Locke and his team during a mission to a shard of Alpha Halo in 2556. This particular Lekgolo colony notably fed on organic beings. I can't help but wonder if the Forerunner plan at all involved Lekgolo Gestalts actually eating the Flood. Because of how Lekgolo gestalts are formed, they can't be infected by the flood in the same way humans, elites, or most other species can. However, they can still be used as raw biomass. I imagine this is part of why the Lekgolo strategy didn't work. Another species the Forerunners used against the flood were the Sharkoi. These massive cyclopean beings were simple-minded on their own, but could be directed when given a neural implant linked to a control helmet known as the Vertex. Their mass and stature, combined with an odd natural resistance to the flood, made the Sharkoi ideal shock troops. Ultimately, it seems they weren't effective enough, and the armies of Sharkoi would be locked away in stasis. Interestingly, Sharkoi were discovered by the Covenant. However, due to their uncontrollable nature, they rarely saw use during the Human-Covenant War. Moving on, perhaps the most well-known and most infamous method of fighting the flood employed by the Forerunners was the contender-class ancilla known as Mendicant Bias. Created centuries prior to the Forerunner Flood War by the Ur-Didact and his rival, the Master Builder, Mendicant was the first of his kind and unlike any AI prior, his massive mind capable of directing all of Forerunner Society's military efforts if need be. Decades prior to the end of the war, Mendicant Bias would be stationed on a halo ring containing human specimens, flood samples, and the being known as the Primordial, aka the Gravemind. For the next 43 years, Mendicant would converse with the Primordial and study the flood, trying to discover any weakness or strategy against the parasite. Unfortunately, the Primordial would instead convince Mendicant Bias that the time of the Forerunners was over, that it should join the flood. The first victim of what would come to be known as the Logic Plague, a philosophical argument that primarily affected Ancilla but could also work on organic minds, Mendicant Bias's betrayal would ensure that any hope of a Forerunner victory was snuffed out. His betrayal was so infamous that the records of him discovered by the Covenant resulted in severe limitations on AI research and implementation for the over 3,000-year existence of Covenant society. When the flood re-emerged in the Milky Way 100,300 years ago, the Forerunner military enacted numerous strategies to slow the flood's advance. Orbital bombardment, a strategy used by ancient humanity and of course later the Covenant, would be enacted on planets lost to the flood even at the cost of the remaining uninfected population. After a time, fallen planets would actually resort to detonating a local WMD, an act of suicide, to prevent the flood's spread. As the war raged, the Forerunner military would also resort to collapsing stars to destroy entire systems. And as system after system fell, civilians would be mandated to wear combat skins of at least Class 12 for their protection, even in non-combat zones. The horrors of the flood are nothing to be underestimated. They are a plague that washes across the stars with such fervor that advanced societies like ancient humans and the Forerunners found themselves on the back foot. For centuries, the Forerunners tried any means available to them to slow or halt the advance of the flood. 1,000 other plans were tried and failed before they were finally forced to fire the halos. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing, and if you really love me, hit that notification bell and leave a thumbs up. These both really help out the channel. The Ark, a massive installation, one of the biggest ever made by the Forerunners, the forge of the Halos, and a sanctuary from their fire. This installation is one that has constantly found itself at the center of conflict, and will so again in Halo Wars 2. Following the Human Forerunner War around 106,445 BCE, the Forerunners discovered a horrible truth. During the war, humanity had claimed they were simply running from another threat, a shaping sickness they called the Flood. As it turned out, the Flood was all too real, and now the Forerunners had to find a way to combat them should they ever return. 1,000 plans would be tried and failed until the final solution, the Halos, would be fired to eliminate the Flood and their food source. The Ark was constructed to serve as a repair and activation installation for the Halo array, though it would also serve other functions such as building replacement Halos and storing the collected species for the conservation measure enacted by the Librarian. Unknown to most, there have actually been 2 Arks. The original Ark, later known as the Greater Ark, was a massive installation with 6 arms and created halo rings of 30,000 kilometers in diameter. These rings fired laterally in a conical shape, rather than omnidirectionally like the final rings. These original rings also feature